Hey, Sheena.
Hey, how's it
Hey,
going?
hey, it's going really well. Looking forward to doing a show together. Thanks for everyone who's here on the live stream or watching that later. And with that, Sheena, welcome to Talk Python to me.
Yeah, thanks so much. Happy to be here.
Yeah, I'm happy to have you here. We've got an awesome topic queued up, one that just, I don't know if I'll ever get tired of coming back to this because I'm just
So
such a
painful.
fan of simplicity and getting stuff done and not like let's see how many layers of things we can pile on. And by that, I mean HTMX as a success story
Mm,
for going from a whole bunch of front end stuff, a bunch of different multiple apps, JavaScript front end, Django back end, talking to each other, but kind of being separate as well.
oh
And just
yeah,
switching to HTMX. And you wrote up a really cool essay on this that we're going to dive into. So, and share your experience.
yeah. It was a pretty fantastic experience overall. I was really surprised by HTMX when I came across it the first time because there are so many fashionable front end libraries and frameworks. So when I heard about it, I was like, oh, it's another one of those, whatever. And then I went to a Django con, I think it was 2022, and I saw a talk from Chris May, who's in the audience, and that got me excited about it. And yeah, that's kind of when my whole story started. So yeah, so what I had been doing before was working with. So I had this team, and we were building a thing, and we had a React front end. So on the front, and that's a normal thing. Like if you wanted like a modern front end application, you'd use something like React or Vue or one of the many competitors, and then on the back end we had Django, and I think that's like a fairly normal, fairly accepted way to do things, or it has been for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's a little faulty. I think that front end web development has been in a little bit of a complexity death spiral for the last little while. And like sometimes it's useful, sometimes it's really helpful, but like for some things you need certain tools in the front end, I think. But yeah, I think it's things have been going in the complexity for or direction for a long time, and HTMX solves a lot of problems. Um,
All right.
yeah,
Well,
so
you
like
think back to the jQuery days. How did you use jQuery? You included a CDN, or if you're
yeah,
wild, you might download it and include it in your own static content,
yeah,
and then you
yeah,
just started using it, right?
yeah,
And
yeah.
just
So this,
layers and layers have just been building, and JavaScript of 2024
mm,
era looks nothing like 10 years ago, 15 years ago JavaScript.
yeah,
I would say it's one of the more complicated programming environments, compared to
yeah,
something like C++, right? Because there's so many steps in there, so many implicit linkings and stuff.
yeah. There's a lot of dark magic under the hood. It's very hard to know what's going on, and I think like one of the challenges is that like a lot of people used to get into web dev as their gateway drug to programming. Like they'd start off
Hmm.
with web dev and then branch out from there. But now web dev is like this magic weird box with so many layers, and I think it's sort of messed a lot of people up. Um, it's a challenge to get started in the way that people used to get started, and it's like the barrier to I don't know entry level programmers used to need to be here, and now it's here,
Yeah,
and
yeah, yeah.
does a lot of tricky things to the ecosystem as a whole. But yeah, like all the build steps, all the magic things that happen under the hood, and the fact that you have to like task switch between completely different applications and completely different like ways of thinking. So for me, I've always loved Django. It's so good. So with the thing that I was building, I wanted Django because I needed to build a thing really, really fast.
Hmm.
And so my efficiency was important. And then it was like, I need a good front end, and React was a clear choice at the time. But it means like switching, like for me to work on this thing, I need to keep holding the Django application and the React application in my head and how they talk. And it's not just React; it's like Redux and Saga and side effects and asynchronous goodies, and then on the Django side, it's all of that. And Django is, I think, much simpler to get your head around than React actually. Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, it's a tricky thing.
Yeah, it definitely is a tricky thing. And one thing I would just like to put out early before we get too much mail is this is not necessarily a hate on JavaScript
Oh no,
sort of
no.
thing. There are people in the node space that are super fans of HTMX. And I think what is not obvious about the benefits of HTMX, as we get into it, we'll talk about some of these things, but you were just touching on then, like you've got this React front end, it has its own state. It also has its own capabilities. So it's running on the client side, so it can't talk to file systems or the database. It can only talk to APIs. On the other hand, you've got the Django app, which probably is not talking to APIs, but talks to the database, talks to, the server levels things. And you've got to, as you're working on this app, think, okay, I'm in this context. That means no database. I'm in this context. That means primarily just database, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
it's just, you have these two worlds. And if you could say, could I just write in one of them? And the
Yes.
JavaScript people might even pick like, I just want to stay in JavaScript, but always Node, or always at least pick one
Yeah.
of the styles of programming, and not just constantly switch back and forth between these. You have browser capabilities, you have server capabilities, you have browser information. Like just that is just not productive. It's not the best, right? And
Yeah.
so as much as you can avoid that, and as we'll see, HTMX is super easy about keeping it in one place, right? So I think that's one of the big things that people should be honing in on as we talk about this. What do you think?
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah, if I came across as hating on JavaScript, I dig JavaScript and I use it a lot where it's needed. I think it is a fantastic tool in the toolbox. But I'm on sides with you that it's just the complexity of switching contexts all the time. It slows you down, and it's a lot to keep in your head. And so it's like for me, when I was working on this application and needing to switch contexts all the time, it's like you can't just make a thing. Like you have to like do the dance to make the thing, and
Set up
like
four different chained file watchers to do their things and stuff, right?
and so it just like adds a little bit of a like you're slower than you would like to be. There's like more tedium than there should be. It would be nice if you could just like build the thing quickly in a simple way and it just works and is beautiful. And HTMX kind of allows that along with other tools. Yeah, so for me, that context switching was like a painful thing. And for the team I was working with as well, like I had a bunch of juniors on my team, and it was so hard to get them productive because it was like, okay, do you want to be productive on the back end, or do you want to be productive on the front end? And then on the front end, like that was complicated because of the again React Redux saga. So they were all just like suffering, and then
And to put real features into place, you've got to do a vertical slice, right? Which hits most, if not all. You probably have to touch the React front end.
yeah.
You probably need some new tiny bits of UI design, so CSS and maybe some SAS build step there, and like then you're doing the server side bits, and then you're doing a database migration, and it just like it's end to end, right?
Yeah, and for some people, it's not even reasonable to expect them to have all of those skills, those end-to-end skills. And then it's like you have to make your team complicated. You have to have a back-end team and a front-end team, and they need to now integrate with each other. And so, like the tech resembles the team stack. Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, we have a group for this layer, a group for that layer, and look, if you're a huge company, maybe that actually makes tons of sense. Maybe I'm not sure. I'm not saying it does, but it may. But when you're a small company, it just doesn't, right?
No. And yeah, like I think when you're building something, you do need to think about the team that's going to be building it, their skills right now, the skills that they're going to have in the future, the skills that you're going to need to pull into the team in the future. And so it's, I don't know if it makes sense to just, well, in my context, it didn't make sense to split up the team. If I had the tools to allow everybody to be in the same place from the beginning, that would have been freaking fantastic.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. That would be awesome. So let's talk a bit about HTMX. So we said, hey, we've been talking about this, but in sort of broad terms, but let's be a little bit specific, and maybe you could tell us like what is this HTMX and why is it not just a different flavor of React or Vue or something? And then maybe we could talk through a few examples.
cool. So the way I explain HTMX to myself is that, like, imagine looking at HTML. HTML is with us. It's going to be with us forever. Maybe not forever, but for a very long time. What if we
There have
like?
been many, yeah, there have been many attempts to replace it, and they were all bad.
Yeah, yeah. So it's probably going to stick around for the foreseeable future, and it's everywhere. And what if we could just augment it slightly so that it could do what we needed it to do in the modern web? Like since HTML got invented, like it's quite a simple tool, but now we need to do all this extra stuff because people expect all sorts of like interactivity in the user interfaces. They expect asynchronous workloads and things like that. And what if HTML could do that? And it can do that, and it's not actually that hard to make it do that. You just need to add a few extra attributes. And so what HTMX is a really, really small JavaScript library. And you just include it as a script tag in your page, and then it's there and it's available and it's installed, just like the good old days of jQuery. And
Yeah, you could just go back and throw it in a CDN if you wanted, couldn't you? That's right. I hadn't really thought about it.
And then from there, you just have these extra attributes on your HTML tags that do different things. So, for example, so HTMX has a lot of different stuff, but if you were to like 80/20 it and look at the parts that are the most used, then basically the stuff you'll use the most are like tying into events, like click event handlers or whatnot. And then when you click on the thing or whatever, it'll send a request to a backend, and the backend responds with an HTML fragment. And then you swap that fragment into your page somewhere. So like so if you were to look at the HTMX documentation, the hello world of HTMX is a button, and the button says has the attributes hx post clicked. So it's saying like when you click on the button, then send a post request to a URL that's like / clicked. So you can decide where, like what HTTP method you're using and where it's going and what event you're tying into, and then when the response arrives, then you do something with it. And the response is HTML. It's not a JSON response that you then need to like turn into HTML. It's plain old normal HTML. So it's super simple to write. And then you take that HTML and you put it somewhere on the page. So maybe you swap the current button that you just clicked with the HTML that was returned, or maybe you take it and you put it like at the end of another element. You could append stuff, you can prepend stuff, you can replace entire elements, you can replace the internals of elements, and that little pattern is actually really, really powerful. And you can tie into all sorts of different events. So there's like interacting with individual elements, like a click or a form submission. You can say like on load or like on scroll or all sorts of different things. So events. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the motivations that Carson Gross puts there is, why should A and Forum only be able to make HTTP requests? Why should you only be able to click and have click and submit events, trigger them, right? And all these things, you know. So it's kind of like just extending some of these niche features. Like you can click a button, but not an image in HTML to all the pieces. And then, like you said, exchanging fragments of HTML, right? Like just instead of sending JSON back and then having the client side turn that into HTML, just do it on the server and stick it where it goes, right? Basically, that's it.
Yeah, so it's dead simple to code as well, which is fantastic. So it's a simple, you just server-side rendering some HTML, like we used to a long time ago. So it feels very familiar to people who got into web dev a long time ago, and the code itself is very, very easy to write. Like initially you might like scratch your head, it's unfamiliar, but give yourself a couple of hours and it'll start to feel familiar. It's lovely to work in.
Yeah, I would also encourage people that want to get started with this and play with this. The examples that they have on the website are pretty comprehensive, right? If you scroll through, I don't know how many there are, maybe 20 or so.
Yeah, more than
And
that. It's a lot.
yeah, perhaps. Yeah, there's a lot of them here. And then, so if you go into each one of them, it'll show you basically some interesting things. So if you go to the first one, the click to edit, it says, here's a bit of static HTML, like a label and a div, and then a button that says click to edit. And all it has is HX get, and it says edit this thing, right? And when you go and click it, like there's a little example at the bottom, you click it, that's all fun. But if you open up the bottom, there's like a little history of interactions and like a, I don't know what you call it, but like a web history that shows what's transferred. So when you clicked edit, here's what the response was, and it shows the HTML fragment, which it then itself is a new HX, has HX events, and then when it saves it, it goes back to the static and so on. And I think it's a really pretty easy way to get a sense for what it is. What do you think?
Yeah, I think so. Those examples are great. I think like one thing that I like to do is use HTMX and a thing called Alpine JS together. So for me, HTMX is great for when the data needs to be passed back and forth. But like for something like this, I'd probably use something like Alpine just to say like show and hide the form. It's also fantastic. So you don't like strictly need it, I suppose, but it does save on like some back and forth, and it does make things a little bit more like in one place, a little bit more like locality of behaviors, a useful thing. So now we're looking at the Alpine JS Hello World. And this is cool because it's like HTMX in that it just adds a couple of extra attributes to your HTML tags. And the 80-20 of this is that you can define variables, and those variables are like a state, and they are defined within the scope of the place where you defined it. So if you have like div x data equals open false as a JSON object, then it's like within the scope of this div, we have this thing called open, and its initial value is false. And then you can do things like click on a button to change open to true, or to toggle open. So you can have it like show form true or false. And then you can say here it says span x row equals open. So we only show that under certain circumstances. And you can also have like not open, or you can have like it speaks JavaScript. So you can do some interesting things in there as well.
Yeah, this looks pretty interesting. This is something I have not really used, but I do hear Alpine and HTMX mentioned together frequently. They do have a similar vibe.
Yeah, they do. I've enjoyed it a lot. I tend to just use it for like small, simple things, but those small, simple things add up. So, for example, if you have menus that open and close and things like that, you might want to use something like this.
Yeah, or event handling, like if you click this button, change the state to this, and then it triggers the binding to open and close sections and so on.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, one example that I can give from over that stuff that I'm working on is I'm definitely using HTMX over at Talk Python Training, right, for our courses, and I added this little tag cloud. It's not quite a cloud, but a bunch of different things you can explore. So when you load this page, actually, one of the things that's really challenging is it has the price in your local currency. So it figures out where's your IP, where do you live, and that currency, the prices of those things, outside of the US change a lot. And sometimes it can be really slow to figure out what the price of every course is if there's sales and you're in this country and that applies in this way. So all these little prices are all calculated with HTMX. So it loads normally without the prices, then probably by the time you get to it, the prices are already there automatically. And then as you click around, this is all like, as you click these little tags up here, you can even click on the HTMX tag and see you have 3 HTMX courses, right? With Flask, Django, and one that just kind of uses it. But all of this stuff, there's no JavaScript on this page, at least not doing any of it. It's all just HTMX, right?
Yeah, that's great.
Beautifully good. It's so good. So, I've certainly enjoyed working with it. But let's talk a bit about you're right. Like let's talk about, spend the rest of the time on your story, how you started using HTMX. I mean, you've given us some of the sense, but let's talk
Yeah.
about the app that you were building. Right, you had this team of
Yeah.
fairly junior developers. What's
Yeah.
the story?
So at the time, I was working for a nonprofit training provider in South Africa, and we used to have everybody on premises in this place called JP's Town, which is really a dodgy place. And it was great. It was a lot of fun. But then COVID happened, and so we had to figure out how to support everybody remotely. And so built an LMS. So initially, we looked around at LMS means learner management system. We had a whole lot of learners. We had, I think there were about 150 at the time, and we needed to figure out how to support them from home. We couldn't just be like, come back next year, because like partially we couldn't let them down, partially the funding model wouldn't work, and all sorts of
Yeah,
things. So
yeah.
we needed.
It was an insane time. It's
Oh,
it's kind of normalized in our history because we've moved past it, but
yeah,
we got
it
to
was.
remember that was a disturbing time.
Yeah, yeah. Like so many people have horror stories from then. I was like, this was hard. It was like super, super stressful. But in the end, we ended up with this cool thing. So yeah, so like a lot of LMSs exist. You can get one off the shelf, and they're a lot like very clever textbooks that track learners over time. But for us, we were training software developers, and so we wanted something more than a textbook. We wanted to train professionals. And so we ended up building this thing. From the learner's perspective, it was a Kanban board, and then they could move cards around on the board to do different things. They could start a project, and then we'd create a repo for them and add them as a collaborator and protect the main branch and all of that good stuff. And then we could get them to review each other, and we could track all that and display it in the front end.
Right.
So it was
Try to
cool.
teach them Git and GitHub and PRs
Yeah.
and all that. Yeah.
Yeah, it was so cool. Like by the time they got to work, they were always very nervous getting into their first job, and then they'd say like, "This is familiar, like we know how
Yeah.
this works," and that was really, really
I'm
cool.
teaching people stuff here, actually. That's weird.
Yeah, it
Yeah,
was great.
exactly. That's cool.
Yeah, so built this thing out and managed to keep training the people, and it worked. And then it was like, okay, this thing is pretty rough around the edges because we built it in self-defense, and we're like, holy shit, I hope this works. um, so we needed to build more on it, and we were hiring a lot of junior developers because we were training like very, very beginner stuff. So if you want to teach a person what a return statement is or what a loop is or anything like that, then you don't need a senior developer or like a senior lecturer. You need somebody who understands what a loop is and what a return statement is. So we had like all these juniors running around like helping out, and they needed to build stuff for their own growth as well, and their own if they don't build stuff, then they wilt, and it's sad.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we're trying to get them productive on the stack, but it was very, very difficult. So for me, I'd been working on React applications, and I've been working on Django, and so for me it was fine. I could just I could keep the whole thing in my head, but yeah, it was just really tough for them. So I think there is a little bit of an art to making a junior developer productive, but I just was not figuring it out. So tried this for a while, and then one day went to a DjangoCon US, and I saw Chris May's talk that spoke about HTMX, and I was just like, maybe this is worth a try. So I was like, okay, I'm just going to proof of concept it and see if I can build the weirdest parts of our application in HTMX. Yeah.
That's awesome. Yeah. Because I guess the question is, if you're asking, will it work? You're like, all right, this is the most crazy interactive bit. And if it can do this, the other stuff is easy. Like switching
Yeah.
from logged in to log out or whatever. It's like, yeah, okay, that's nothing, right?
Yeah. So most of our functionality was around this Kanban board. So I was like, all right, let me just make some cards and make some columns and see if I can shift stuff around. And it all worked out really well, and it wasn't super hard. Like I think one of the challenges with HTMX is that it's very easy to build like spaghetti templates because you have like the main template and all these partials, and you need to, and then all these URLs that are pointing to the partials. So it is possible to get yourself in a bit of a tangle there. So you need to arrange things nicely. But yeah, the process was so smooth that I was like, let me try this. So our application was this Django app on the back, exposing a bunch of APIs with Django REST framework. And so the idea was to just, instead of like we'd leave the React app as is and would keep on working. Meanwhile, we'd just build out some like perfectly normal Django views to do the HTMX stuff, and then we could move everybody over to the new application. So the new front end was part of the original Django app. So we didn't rebuild absolutely everything. We just rebuilt that part. And generally speaking, if somebody suggests rebuilding a thing, I worry. Like usually it's a bad idea. Usually it's like, full or something. Yes, I've had to stop myself many times.
Do you know that David? Is it David not Beasley, Beatty? If you look for, there's a great song. It says, "We're going to do the big rewrite." On YouTube. Let's see. Yeah, there we go. This this is so good. So if I think it's got some ad. Dylan Beatty it is. Yeah, check. I'll put a link in here. He's got some amazing parodies, and it's a 6.5 minute parody of American Pie. We're going to do the big rewrite, and it's glorious. So anyway, I'll link it, but you should be afraid, right? This is something that like we're going to rewrite it, and basically the song is, here's the 8 different languages this thing's previously been written in. You know, it's when something's working. Sometimes, even if it's not perfect, you just.
Yeah, and it was also like rewriting it in order to optimize for this team that was mostly juniors, and so I was like, is this me being crazy? Like there was a lot of I was very unsure. But then, so I tried everything out, and it worked, and it was fun, and it was like straightforward to write for this like small thing. And then I was like, let me see how the team works on this. So I gave them a bunch of little tasks to do. I was like, implement this, try that, and everybody was productive. So I felt like,
how did they receive it when you introduced this idea to them after they'd been living in React and Redux and all these things?
I think for them, they were happy with it. I think at first a little bit skeptical, but then once they started going, like I did get feedback from them. I make a point of getting feedback from them, and they were like, this HTMX thing is way better. So that's
nice.
Great.
Like, wait, what's the trick? Why does this work?
Yeah. So they went with it, but then they succeeded, and they were happy and productive, which is great. And like even people who needed like way too much of my support, like people who I had to like really sit with and pair with, like just to do like anything, they were suddenly able to do stuff that was meaningful. So I think for me, that's one of the things that's so exciting about HTMX. It's like I've been working in training for so long, and I've been like fighting the fight of like getting junior developers job ready for so long that like I'm aware of many problems in the tech education ecosystem and the junior hiring ecosystem, and like the fact that entry level positions are like too hard for people like is a problem. And now we have tools that make web development approachable again. So like I'm singing this HTMX song because I think it's going to change the industry in some pretty big ways. I think it's already making waves, but I'd like them to happen faster and bigger.
Yeah. I think it will as well. And I think the current web frameworks are really good and work really well with it, but I wonder if I wouldn't be surprised to see kind of like Fast API came along and just said Pydantic is the essence of this thing, and Pydantic changed a lot of data exchange, a lot of data validation. I'd wonder if some framework comes along and just says HTMX is just ground up part of this thing. All right, that'd be interesting to see what that looks like.
It would be interesting. I think there are definitely useful patterns and how to do different things, and people are building tools around it, or tools that complement it in useful ways. So we spoke about Alpine JS. There's another thing called template partials from the other Carlton Gibson, and that's really, really great.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. This is something like this is super needed to make the code go from like, all right, we can do this to, oh, that's
Yeah.
nice. Yeah.
This
That's super
really
nice.
yeah. This really unspaghettifies it, which is
Yes.
fantastic. Like, this is one of my favorites at the moment.
Yeah, this is
And then
awesome.
you get things like, yeah.
I have one that I created for Jinja partials, and also a chameleon one. So since I wasn't using for that
templates, yeah.
course example, this is actually chameleon. So I use the chameleon partials. But
Yeah.
something like this is required, and Carlton does great work, right?
Yeah, known for it.
So you're using this as part of your site.
So not that original site. I only heard about this later on, but now I use it on everything. Yeah, on all of my HTMX things, I use this.
Right. Tell the Django people, what does this do? Like, why do you need Django template partials instead of just Django templates?
So it's just about organizing your code in a way that's a bit cleaner. So if you think about how you would render templates from your different views, if you had like a main page, and then that page had a bunch of HTMX things happening that made calls to the back end to different views, and those different views use different templates, then even though all those templates are associated with the same page, it kind of ends up being a bit of a mess. You've got like a lot of different like partial templates. Now you need a cool naming convention for that. Like, is this a page? Is this a template? And it gets just a little bit messy. And you need to switch between files all the time to see what things are associated with each other. Let's say you've got like 5 pages, and each of them have like 5 different partials associated with them. Suddenly it's a lot of files, and you need to organize things somehow. So what Django template partials does is it allows you to like say you've got like a main page file, to-do list, right? You could define a partial template for a to-do item within that same file, and it won't get rendered until you say render this thing. So you can, like, when you render your template for the first time, you can just say, okay, loop over the to-do items and use this partial in place and render the things, and that's great. But then the other thing that you can do is that you can, like, in a view, you can choose to render a template, but you can choose to render a partial within that template as well. And so let's say you've got a little form that says add a new to-do list item, then you'd submit that form, and then the view would look for the partial within the page that you care about, and it'll render that. And so it just ends up being that like everything is tidy and together, and it makes sense because like the to-do list items are only used in this page, and those items are only used in that page.
Yeah. One of the big challenges that you'll quickly run into with this style, this HTMX partial exchange style, is when you show the page originally, you want just the server rendered version, which includes, let's say, your to-do items. So you need the HTML for the to-do items in the main page, but then when you make changes to it, you need a little fragment of that same HTML to put a new to-do item in there, or to edit one or something. And if you're not careful, well, then you have multiple copies of those laying around, and somebody updates the design for one, and then it doesn't update the partial one that you wrote, which is a copy. It's not pretty. So finding a way for reuse like this Django templates partials, it's pretty required, I think, if you're going to stay sane. It's like functions are required to write code. It's pretty much like that, right?
Yeah. I think so. Like, you can get away with just using like lots of files, and you could keep things dry with lots of files, but it gets it's very spaghetti unless you put a lot of effort into organizing it and then keeping it organized, because people will make PRs that do like all sorts of weird things. So it's not good to have to like monitor that everything's organized. It would be better if it was just there done by default.
Yeah,
Like
exactly.
the
So
the default behavior is correct. Yeah.
yeah, so grab a file, a library for that. All right, so let's talk about the before and after stack. So before you talked about React, but tell us all the pieces involved, and then like, what does it look like today?
Okay, cool. So React Redux. So Redux was for just state management, and then I used Redux Saga for mostly for data fetching stuff, so that I could handle like loading spinners, and I could see like like the status of different requests over time and that kind of thing. Then I use Material UI because my like front end make pretty skills aren't the strongest. So I wanted a component library that would just work, and that was the chosen one. Then on the back end, it was Django. Django REST framework is fairly well known. Then I used a thing called Django Guardian because I needed object level permissions on the different model instances. So, for example, so we had this Kanban board, and there were cards on this board that people could move around, and different people would have different permission to different cards. So we had things like one learner would be working on a card, and then they'd ask for a review, and then another learner should be able to review that. But we wouldn't want to let just any learner look at their code, because then it would cause all sorts of problems. So it's like, okay, this person has finished this project, so we can add them as a reviewer on this card. And so we needed to be like pretty particular about like which of our users could see different things. It wasn't super straightforward in that this person can see this. It was like this person can for these reasons. Yeah, so Django Guardian is really, really cool. And then Postgres.
That's a cool library. Maybe people could find a nice use for that one. Like that's the one that's new to me. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really nice. And you can even do things like when you query a database and you say, fetch me all the cards, you can do something like fetch me all the cards that Bob can see. And so long as it's configured well, then it can do that sort of thing. Which is very, very helpful.
Wow, that's really cool. So you don't have to go get all the cards and then, who have all these different permissions, and then like construct some query that comes up with it. Yeah, very nice. I love it.
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah, so, super cool. Right. And that plugs into DRF as well. So your like your serializer or your view sets. I haven't worked in it in a while, but the query that gets used when you access like a list API endpoint, you could just apply that automatically as well. So if you don't need to build it in that case either. So it plugs into all of the things. It's a little bit weird at first to get used to, and then it's just fantastic.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. And now I'm guessing much of the front end stuff is probably not there.
Yeah. So the old application still exists, but it's not. But it's like the HTMX based version would just be a drop-in replacement. It's like go to this URL instead, kind of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome. Hold on. Let's see. So, I guess now that it's done, you said you used to work there, but you don't work there anymore. Is that right?
Oh yeah, not anymore. As of a few months ago.
Right. So maybe, I guess that's recent enough to say sort of, how is it going now, right? How is it being used? How are people, is it still going strong as the technology?
Yeah, the tech is solid. Yeah, so I hope that they're still building on it. There was some weird things happening at the organization before I left. So yeah, I expect, I hope that everything is still going smoothly, but I haven't been plugged in for a while. Yeah.
Yeah, let's give maybe a quick shout out to, let me try to grab it. Give it a second. I want to give a quick shout out to this video, this other Django Con talk. Gosh, why is I need to sign into my YouTube Premium on this browser, but this real world SaaS product example from this guy in
Yeah.
France, David Gilliot. Yeah, that one you said was a pretty good
Yeah.
example if you need like a
Yeah.
walkthrough
Yeah.
case.
Yeah, so that one I didn't see it live. I saw a video of it after the fact, but it is like the ultimate HTMX demo. It shows this guy really makes it dance. It's quite an amazing thing to see. So highly recommend that.
Yeah, this guy David goes through and says, here's our complex SaaS product, and
Yeah.
let me walk you through all the features. I feel like this would be a pretty good one. Your article as well, and then this video. If you want to say make a case to your team, like, hey everyone, could we consider doing this? And I'm sure right off
Yeah.
the bat you'll get some folks say, well, no, we have to use React because it's interactive. You interact with that part and it changes that part. How are we going to possibly pull that off? It's like, yeah, no, that's totally possible.
Yeah, I think the main arguments people have against it are like scale, but that argument doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I think it might be complexity scale that they're concerned about, but I think things like template partials solve a lot of that problem.
Yeah.
And then there's can it do the things, and this solves that problem. And then is it really so much better for the team is the other question. Is it just another fashion? Is it just another fad? And that's something that's sometimes hard to get across. And I think that my article will do a good job of explaining why it's a good idea, because I had to explain this to non-technical stakeholders. I was like, okay, I'm making this crazy decision and this is why. And so I think I've got the argument down. Go read that article if you need to convince someone. Yeah. But I think the other thing to mention is the full stack that I moved to in the end. So HTMX we spoke about, Django we spoke about, and Alpine we spoke about. Now, if you are running a React front end or whatever, you would test the front end in a React-y way, like you would use tools that are appropriate for that. So you need to think about different ways to test things, and unit tests are.
Would that be like Selenium or something, or what are we talking?
So I like Playwright quite a lot. So you could do it with Selenium, but that would be it would include some pain. Playwright is very, very lovely to work with. So it's like Selenium, only with all sorts of useful test goodies built in. So like you can get it to take videos of your failed tests, and it's got useful flags for like running your tests on different browsers, and you can like keep a trace of things. It's got interesting debugging stuff built in, and you can just run it with PyTest. So yeah, Playwright is a big part of it as well.
Yeah, Playwright is really nice. One thing that just occurred to me around the testing, if you've got a rich JavaScript front end sort of thing, you have to use something like Playwright or Selenium, where it does a full browser request render of the page to interact with it, right?
Yeah.
And you can also do that with HTMX. But a lot of these web frameworks, you can just, in your web test code, you can say, create like a testing instance of my server, right? And then make it do this request and then see what the response came back without nearly the same overhead. And because this stuff all happens on the server, I guess you could just write a unit test, like a web test against a fragment response, right?
Yeah, you can. So you can write little unit tests that check different things like that. But since a lot of the interactivity is defined within the HTML tags, your unit tests won't be able to cover like if the user clicks this and that happens. And so that's where something like Playwright will come in.
Yeah, you'll still need that but maybe less Playwright is needed otherwise, is what I was thinking.
Yeah, definitely. I think one of the anti-patterns I've seen is too much Playwright, where they're just like, want to use Playwright for everything, and then your tests are ridiculously slow. And it's like, you could have just, you didn't even need to test the view. There was this function that you wanted to test.
Exactly. You're not Shakespeare. You don't need that much Playwright. Come on, get focused. Yeah, Playwright is a cool thing. I definitely recommend it.
Yeah. And it plugs into Django really smoothly as well. So you don't actually, for Playwright, it spins up a browser and points it at a running instance of an application in order to like test the things. But with Django and PyTest, you can use a fixture to spin up a like test version of your application. It's kind of like run servers running there in your tests anyway. So yeah, it integrates very, very smoothly. Yeah, it makes it very convenient.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, one of the things you wrote a lot about, and you mentioned this, but you kind of flew past it a little bit, was you said, "Am I crazy for optimizing for junior developers?" Right? On the other hand, on the other hand, optimizing for simplicity, even
Yeah.
if you're
Yeah.
an
Yeah.
expert, right? You don't, just because you can do all the steps and all the complexity doesn't mean you should
Yeah.
constantly be doing those steps, right?
Yeah.
And
Definitely.
so I think there's a case for optimizing for simplicity here. What do you think?
I completely agree. I mean, if you can just like take the cognitive load of developing your app and then make it like simple, so you can focus on actually solving problems instead of like wiring, I suppose. And life gets a lot easier. So yeah, simplicity rocks. It's fast to develop, but things like HTMX make your code way smaller than it would otherwise be. So it's not just simple. It's not just that it's less convoluted. There's also less of it, and so there's less to test. There's less stuff that can cause bugs, and most of the like front end interactivity is handled by another library that's really well tested, and you're just doing these like tiny little things that are easy to reason about, and so it's just it's robust and clean.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I do think it's worth optimizing for simplicity. I mean, it made everybody more productive, the juniors and me as well. So, top notch. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm constantly in pursuit of,
Yeah.
of trying to keep things simple. You know, if you go over to the HTMX site, I don't know if you've looked at this section, but they've got a, Kirsten has this essays section, which is, it's not quite a blog, but it's kind of a blog. It's not in order, it's in sort of category or whatever. And these are all nice. One thing that's nice is he has a, on the other hand, here's a couple of examples why people didn't pick it, right?
Yeah.
But he's got a whole section on complexity, very, very bad.
Yeah.
But if you keep going, there's a
memes.
bunch of memes. The memes are so good, aren't they?
They are fantastic.
And one of these super definitely applies is, there's one that says HTML plus a backend for like it's got this bell curve for the beginners. Like, oh, this is what I want. That as you get a little bit better, you're like, oh, I need all this complexity and all these layers. And then, sort of the Jedi Knight at the end is, HTML on the back end, right? Going through this path. And
Like,
I think these two ends, I don't necessarily want to characterize beginners that look like this character in this meme, but, I think the meme still speaks to us somewhat, right?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think it's about like when I teach people to code, when I teach people like the very basics of code, and like something I see with very junior developers is that they try to show off and be like, look how fancy I can make my code. I can do all of these complicated things. And then you get them to think more like Jedis and say like, don't waste any moves. Like how you wouldn't be flailing about. Like this is kind of like flailing. HTMX does that for you. It just lets you like move directly towards your goal instead of having to like move around it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty glorious. So I know that you do a lot of teaching. Maybe you said you work for this local company that you did the Kanban board app for and so on.
Yeah.
And now what are you up to?
So still teaching, just differently. So yeah, it was really cool working there. I was there for a long time, like 5 years in total, which is like really long, and it was super successful. So like since 2020, basically everybody who passed our courses ended up getting good jobs. Like very, very close to 100% of the people who passed. And the people who didn't pass is like actually kind of small, like 7%. And there's lots of reasons for that. But yeah, I learned a ton from being there.
Was that in person? That was in person, but pre-COVID, right?
Yeah, so post-COVID, we actually got way, way better. Because we had better monitoring of individuals, and we could do things like track people's cards on their board moving around, and then from that you can say like, oh, this piece of content is dodgy. Like it would give us as educators a lot of feedback about what we were doing, because if a person was stuck and you're like, I explained this thing great, and then they're still stuck, you're like, I didn't explain this thing great. And so like the way that the teaching mechanism was built was like really good for the students, but like if we as educators didn't do a good job on something, we'd know about it and we'd have to fix it. And I think that honed the craft quite a lot. So I learned a bunch there. Now what I'm doing is I want to spread those skills in different ways. So there's a whole lot to what I'm doing. One thing I want to do is help educators themselves. So I've got this thing called the Guild of Educators, because I always wanted a guild. And it's got a whole lot of people in there who are like, it's a free community. Come and join. It's a bunch of education nerds who talk about education with each other. It's a support structure, because I think educators need support structures. And it's a place to share learnings and share resources and opportunities and things like that. So it's still very new, but that's one part of it. I want to offer teacher training and things like that.
Yeah,
but
that's
I
cool.
also
Just like we have junior developers. You have people got to start somewhere with teaching, and teaching online is different. All that, yeah.
Yeah, and it's hard because there aren't really good resources for tech educators. There's like if you dig into the literature on how learning works and how teaching works, it's all either very academic, and so it's a little bit hard to pass, and it's not like it's just not packaged well for the people who need it, or it's packaged in the wrong way. So I came across a code school recently who I was like, how do you handle your teacher training? And they're like, we outsource it to these guys. And they showed me this other organization that does teacher training, and it's like I dug through their courses, and one of their selling points was like, our teacher training courses are so versatile that they can be used for florists and personal trainers. I was like, yeah, maybe not appropriate for what we're up to here. But that's what people are relying on. And that's like the best that the industry has to offer. So I think there's a big hole in the education space, and I want to work to fill that. So that's part of what I'm doing, and the other part is offering technical training, and this is partially because you got to practice the craft, partially because I want to create opportunities for educators to get good, partially because I really like teaching this stuff. So there's all different reasons why I'm teaching. So right now I'm building out a bunch of small workshops that cover different skills and are fairly standalone. And those are Lego blocks that will combine into something much bigger in the future. But for now, the first workshop that I have on offer is all about Django and HTMX.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's very it's pretty exciting. So it talks about the stack that we just spoke about. We didn't mention Tailwind, but Tailwind is great as well. It means that I can make front ends that look reasonable. So long as
that's right. You said you had used Material UI previously to make it good. And Tailwind is what you used in the new version?
Yeah.
Excellent. Okay.
Yeah, I'm really enjoying Tailwind. Yeah, so the idea with this little workshop, I ran it as part of DjangoCon US recently, and it was super cool. I don't know, there were way too many people there, which was great. But
that's a good problem. It's a very good problem.
It's a good problem to solve. It's like, whoa, all of you. So that was super cool and went really well. The basic idea is that I want to show how to build a CRUD application using the stack of tools in a way that sets people up to be able to build their own stuff. And part of the workshop is, in fact, taking these tools and building your own thing. And so for people who are kind of early on their career, in their career, they can get some, like, the starts of decent portfolio projects out of it. People built all sorts of interesting things. So like the one person built their own personal learner management system for like their own learning, which was really lovely. Somebody built a music store. Somebody else built a what was it? Like a chore manager for their family so that they don't fight so much. It was great.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, and all with Django, HTMX, and Alpine.js, and the others. And the other thing that's cool about this is it's a CRUD application. Like I'm teaching people the bits and pieces that build a CRUD app, and like most of the internet is CRUD applications, because it's for the audience. Like if anybody hasn't heard of CRUD, it's create, read, update, delete. Like that's most of what you need to do on the internet. And so if you get the patterns down for like a simple CRUD app, then you can do some pretty hardcore things with it. So yeah, this is so it's covering that. The workshop is small, so it's like I'm keeping things very, very small intentionally, because I believe in the power of teachers, and I want to make sure that everybody gets attention and gets the support that they need. And also because the people who tend to come to these kinds of things have different backgrounds. So some people need help here, some people need help there, and so you need to keep like a good ratio of teachers to students. So
Right.
yeah, expert-led, high support, small group, all of that good stuff. I'm
Nice.
quite excited.
Yeah. That's
Yeah.
very cool. I'll link to this workshop in the show notes if people want to check it out. And it's at a time, but it's remote, so people can attend from wherever,
yeah.
right? You don't have to be
Yeah.
near you.
Yeah, so you don't need to be in South Africa. In fact, I made it in US Eastern time, because strangely enough, most of the people who read my blog are in the US. Like, so it's US and South Africa, and it shifts and changes around. But part of the reason I'm marketing it to the US is because I want to be able to fund training Africans, and like there just isn't as much money on the side of the world. So yeah, I want to be able to make doing good in the tech education space into something that's financially sustainable. So that's why the US, and that is why it's priced in dollars.
Yeah.
So you guys can have a discount code. Talk Python, talk_Python. I think that was the
Right
one
on.
I said. Let me just
Yeah, I'll put it in show notes. People can find it there.
Awesome. So you'll get 10% off. And then I also want to give like another 10% to something. So Foxley wanted me to give 10% from their discount code to the DSF. So that's another code that's out there. So that's fantastic. I've definitely benefited a lot from the DSF. So that's really, really cool. So since this is your podcast, should the further 10% go to the DSF or the PSF or the DjangoCon Africa event?
Oh my goodness. I
Right,
vote
choice.
I vote Django Con Africa.
Fantastic. I was hoping that you'd say that. Yeah, I love DjangoCon Africa. It's so freaking cool.
Yeah. Speaking of conference and talks and stuff, Kim out in the audience says in a few weeks a really good talk Sheena gave at South Africa PyCon. A few weeks ago should be online. Power to the people who teach the people to code. So
Yes, that's
cool.
the longest title I've had for a talk ever. Thanks, Kim. Yeah, so I did that talk at PyCon South Africa, and I also did it. I did a longer version of it at DjangoCon US as a keynote. So I was super happy that I got that opportunity. It was so cool. But yeah, it just talks about kind of how I think about teaching and how I. So it's how I think about teaching and the mechanisms that we set up. So like, how does mastery-based learning work, and how do you engineer a education system so that it sets people up for success and not like either frustration or boredom. Like, because there's a lot of things that are weird about the traditional systems. Yeah, so it talks about that, but then it also shares a bunch of lessons for individual educators on the ground. So that thing that I was talking about earlier about how we as educators in the system were getting like a ton of feedback about our own the quality of our work. That gave us space to figure out a lot of like hard hitting things. So it's kind of the 80-20 of what teachers or would be teachers should focus on. And I think it's powerful because a lot of like everybody teaches. I mean, you teach, people teach new team members. Like there's a lot of volunteer teachers as well, which is great. I mean, there's stuff.
I think doing this kind of these presentations, this kind of teaching is a super cheat code for leveling up your own skills.
Yeah, definitely. There's this thing called the protege effect, which is a well-studied thing. So when people say teaching is a great way to learn, they're not just being squishy. Like it's legit. It's really, really legit. And there are a lot of mechanisms behind it. It's like one of the simple ones is that teaching is spaced repetition and recall, and that helps you remember your stuff. Another one is like people will ask you weird questions that you wouldn't expect, and so you look at your own knowledge from a different direction and you build better mental frameworks, or more robust mental frameworks. Like some people are good at building mental frameworks and some people aren't as good, and a good way to like get a person to build good mental frameworks is to ask them weird like left side questions about the stuff they know and get them to look at things from different angles. So you get that from the people you're teaching. It's a beautiful thing.
Yeah, it really is. It definitely rounds out your knowledge and makes you
think
deeply about some of these ideas that you just maybe glossed over.
Yeah.
Well, I think this is probably a good place to leave it. I want to give out one more resource real quick for people. Is just awesome HTMX over on GitHub. I don't know if you poked around this, but it's got many examples of tools and libraries for HTMX in Python, but also in a ton of other languages. So,
fantastic. That's super cool.
Apparently, there's a Flask HTMX Tailwind one, and one for sockets, or maybe HTMX over WebSockets. I don't know. These all look pretty cool, so people can check them out. But yeah,
fantastic.
And I definitely want to recommend people check out your essay, and they can take these ideas and run with them. Yeah, cool. Well, Gina, thanks for being on the show. It's been great to talk to you.
Yeah, it's been great to talk to you too. This was a lot of fun.
It was. Bye all.
Cheers.